The lawyer across the table stopped writing. He set down his pen, looked up at the man sitting across from him, a 61-year-old retired mechanic named Walter Pruitt, still in his work boots, a leather folder resting on his knees, and said the words slowly, like he needed to hear himself say them to believe them. "Mr. Pruitt, if this document is authentic, and if it holds up in county court, you don't just own a schoolhouse." He tapped the yellowed page in front of him, careful not to press too hard on the brittle paper. "You may own the mineral and water rights to 1,100 acres of land that 4 different companies have spent the last 30 years trying to buy, lease, and litigate their way into, including the land the new Whitlock quarry sits on right now." Walter didn't say anything. He just looked down at the paper. A single page folded in thirds, the ink faded to the color of weak tea, dated March the 14th, 1887. He had found it 3 weeks earlier, on his hands and knees in the dark, underneath a rotted floorboard in a one-room schoolhouse he'd bought for $800 because teenagers kept breaking in to drink beer and smash windows. He had wanted to stop the trespassing. Instead, he'd found the reason half the county was about to end up in court. 6 months before that conversation, Walter Pruitt wasn't thinking about charters, mineral rights, or lawyers. He was thinking about his fence line. Walter lived alone on 18 acres just outside the small town of Barrow Hollow, a place small enough that everyone still called the gas station the new one, even though it had been built in 1994. He'd spent 38 years fixing engines at the same shop on Main Street before he sold it and retired, and these days his biggest concern was keeping his knees working and his dog fed. His property backed up against a half-acre lot that held the old Barrow Hollow Schoolhouse, a single-room, whitewashed building with a bell tower, built sometime in the 1880s and closed since 1961, when the county consolidated the small rural schools into one central building in town. For over 60 years, the old schoolhouse had just sat there, paint peeling, windows boarded, then unboarded by vandals, then boarded again, roof sagging a little more every winter. For most of those years, nobody cared. But in the last 2 years, it had become a magnet for the town's teenagers. Beer cans, spray paint, a bonfire that got a little too close to the old wood siding one October night and brought the volunteer fire department out at 2 a.m. Walter had been the one to call it in. He'd been the one to call it in twice more after that, too. The county owned the lot but had no money and less interest in dealing with it. So when Walter found out, almost by accident, that the county was planning to auction the property just to get it off the books and stop the liability exposure, he did something that surprised even himself. He put in a bid, $800. Nobody else bid against him. Nobody else wanted a 140-year-old building with a collapsing roof sitting on a half-acre nobody could build anything on, thanks to a decades-old easement running through the middle of the lot. "I just wanted the kids to stop climbing my fence to get to the place," Walter told his neighbor Denny the week after the sale closed. "Didn't think I'd actually have to do anything with it." But once he owned it, staring at that sagging roofline every morning from his porch, something in him, some old mechanic's instinct for fixing things that were broken simply because they were broken, took hold. He decided to fix it up, not for money, not for the town, just because it bothered him to own something falling apart. His late wife, Carol, had been a schoolteacher herself for 22 years, though not at this particular schoolhouse. It had closed a decade before she'd started teaching. Still, Walter found himself thinking about her more than usual as he worked, imagining rows of children at little wooden desks, a wood stove in the corner, chalk dust hanging in the light from the tall windows. Carol had passed 4 years earlier, and the house had gotten quiet in a way Walter still hadn't fully learned to live inside of. Fixing up an old building nobody asked him to fix gave his hands something to do, and his mind somewhere to go that wasn't the empty side of the bed. He wasn't in any hurry. Retirement had taught him that much, at least, that a man could take his time with things now, that there was no foreman waiting on him, no customer's car up on the lift needing to be out the door by 5. He worked a few hours most mornings, weather allowing, hauling out the last of the trash, patching the roof section by section, replacing rotted siding boards he matched as closely as he could to the original lap pattern. The work started simple: new plywood over the broken windows, a tarp over the worst section of roof to stop the leaking before winter. Walter cleared out 60 years of trash, bottles, spray cans, a rotted couch someone had apparently carried in through a window at some point, for reasons no one would ever know. It was in early spring, while he was replacing the warped floorboards along the north wall, the section that had taken on the most water damage over the decades, that Walter noticed something odd. One of the boards near the old teacher's platform didn't sit flush like the others. When he pried it up, expecting rot or a nest of mice, he found instead a shallow compartment built into the subfloor itself, deliberately built, with mitered corners and an old iron latch gone orange with rust. Inside was a metal box, the kind that might have once held important documents in a bank or a courthouse. It was locked, and the lock had fused solid with a century and a half of rust. Walter almost didn't open it. He almost just set it aside, thinking it was probably an old lunch pail or a broken clock some long-gone teacher had hidden away and forgotten. He'd found stranger things in stranger places during 38 years of pulling engines apart. But that night, sitting at his kitchen table, he worked the rusted latch loose with penetrating oil and a flathead screwdriver, patient the way you have to be patient with old machinery. When the lid finally gave, it let out a groan like it hadn't opened since Grover Cleveland was president, which, as it turned out, wasn't far from the truth. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth that had somehow kept most of the moisture out, was a single folded document, handwritten, the ink brown with age but still legible under lamplight. At the top, in a careful, formal, old-fashioned hand, were the words, "Charter of Incorporation and Land Grant, Township of Barrow Hollow, March 14, 1887. Walter read the first paragraph twice before he understood he wasn't looking at a receipt or a deed. He was looking at the actual founding document of the town he'd lived in his whole life. He sat with it for a long time that night, longer than he probably should have given he had a knee replacement follow-up appointment the next morning. He read the looping, formal signatures at the bottom, 5 names, men who had probably ridden in on horseback, to sign it, men whose descendants, for all Walter knew, might still be living 3 streets over from him, without any idea their great-great-grandfather's name was sitting in a rusted box under a schoolhouse floor. He noticed the wax seal, mostly cracked away now, and the careful border someone had drawn by hand around the document's edge, the way a person draws a border around something they consider important enough to protect. What struck him most, oddly, wasn't the legal language at all. It was a single handwritten line near the bottom margin, added almost like an afterthought in a slightly different ink, as if someone had come back to the document later and wanted to make sure the point wasn't lost in all the formal wording above it. That no child of this township shall ever want for a place to learn, so long as this earth beneath them provides. Walter read that line 4 times. Then he put the document carefully back into its oilcloth, set it on top of his refrigerator like it was something too important to leave on a table, and didn't sleep much that night. Walter wasn't a lawyer, and he'd be the first to say he didn't understand half of what the old document said in its full legal language, but he understood enough to know it was strange, and that it mattered. The charter, signed by 5 founding landowners and a county judge, laid out the original boundaries of the township, and more importantly, a specific clause about mineral timber and water rights on what it called the common lands. Roughly 1,100 acres surrounding the original town center. land that had been set aside according to the document for the perpetual benefit of the schoolhouse and its founding trust, to fund education for the township's children in perpetuity. The clause specified that these rights could never be sold, transferred, or leased away from the schoolhouse trust, only administered by whoever held legal title to the schoolhouse itself, for the benefit of the town's education. And crucially, the original document had never been formally filed with the state, a common oversight in small frontier townships in the 1880s, when county recording offices were miles away and record-keeping was inconsistent at best. Instead, the founders had apparently kept the original copy hidden inside the schoolhouse itself, perhaps intending to file it later, or perhaps simply trusting the building to outlast any courthouse fire, of which the region had suffered two in 1901 and 1933, both of which had destroyed significant portions of the county's early land records. Walter didn't know any of that history yet. All he knew, sitting at his kitchen table at 11 at night with his dog asleep at his feet, was that he was holding something that used the words mineral rights and in perpetuity in the same sentence, and that he now legally owned the one-room schoolhouse this document said the rights were tied to. He called his cousin, who was a paralegal 2 counties over, the next morning. "Don't tell anyone about this yet," she told him after he described it over the phone. "Not the county, not your neighbors, not anybody. Get it to a real estate attorney first. If this is what it sounds like, people are going to have opinions about it real fast." Walter didn't fully understand how much it mattered until his cousin put him in touch with an attorney named Cal Rutherford, a land use specialist 2 hours away in the county seat. The same lawyer from the cold open, the one who set down his pen mid-sentence. Rutherford spent 2 days researching before he called Walter back. What he found reshaped the entire situation. The 1,100 acres described in the 1887 charter weren't just any land. Over the following century, that land had been subdivided, sold, resold, and eventually consolidated by several parties, including, most significantly, a company called Whitlock Aggregate and Stone, which in the last decade had opened a limestone quarry directly on a large section of what the charter called the common lands. Whitlock had purchased what they believed was clean title to the mineral rights beneath that land back in the 1990s, from a holding company that had, in turn, acquired it from a chain of prior owners stretching back decades. As far as every deed on file at the county courthouse showed, the mineral rights were clean, transferable, and fully owned by Whitlock. But if the 1887 charter was valid, if a court determined that the original township charter legally reserved those mineral rights for the schoolhouse and its founding trust, and that this reservation had never been properly extinguished, because the founding document itself had never been recorded and therefore never legally superseded, then every subsequent sale of those mineral rights over the past century might have been selling something the sellers never actually had the legal right to sell in the first place. "This isn't a small technicality, Walter," Rutherford told him over the phone, his voice carrying the particular calm lawyers use right before they say something enormous. "If this holds up, Whitlock has been quarrying limestone off land whose mineral rights may legally belong to whoever holds title to that schoolhouse, which, as of $800 in a county auction, is you." Walter sat down on his porch step, the fall air cool around him, and looked out at the old schoolhouse's bell tower rising above the tree line. "I just wanted the kids to stop breaking in," he said, mostly to himself. "News like that doesn't stay quiet in a town of 2,000 people for long, no matter how many times a lawyer says the word confidential." It was Denny, Walter's neighbor, who first noticed the black SUV with the Whitlock Aggregate logo parked outside Walter's property one Tuesday afternoon, and the county clerk's office that first noticed someone requesting historical land survey records going back to the 1880s. a request that came unusually from Rutherford's office, and a second request. 2 days later from Whitlock's own legal counsel, who had somehow also caught wind that something was stirring. By the following week, it wasn't a secret anymore. The town split roughly into 3 camps. There were the people who thought Walter was about to become the richest man Barrow Hollow had ever produced and treated him accordingly. Congratulations at the diner, a sudden interest from cousins he hadn't heard from in 15 years. A stranger who showed up at his door offering to help him manage his new fortune for a modest fee. There were the people worried about their jobs. Whitlock Aggregate employed nearly 90 people at the quarry, a significant chunk of the town's working population, and the rumor that the whole operation might be shut down or forced into a massive payout spread faster and got scarier with every retelling. Some of those people weren't happy with Walter at all. A few said so to his face at the gas station, and there were the people who cared more than anything about the schoolhouse itself, about the fact that this whole situation existed because a founding generation of Barrow Hollow in 1887 had tried to permanently guarantee that their children's education would never depend on anyone's goodwill or budget cuts, and had built that guarantee quite literally into the floor of the very building where those children learned to read. The county superintendent of schools, a woman named Louise Aldrich who'd spent 30 years fighting for funding for the district's aging buildings, showed up at Walter's door not with anger or excitement, but with tears in her eyes. "Do you understand what this could mean for this district?" she said. "If it's real." Walter, who had genuinely never once in 61 years imagined himself as the center of anything, didn't have a good answer for her. He just told her he'd let the lawyers figure out if it was real first. Whitlock Aggregate did not simply concede. The company's regional manager, a measured man named Frank Delaney who had lived in the county nearly as long as Walter had, tried at first to handle it quietly. A private meeting over coffee, an offer to fund a reasonable settlement in exchange for Walter signing away any claim before things went any further. Walter turned that down too, not out of greed, but because by that point Rutherford had made something clear to him that stuck. This wasn't really about Walter's money anymore. It was about whether a 140-year-old promise, buried and forgotten, still counted for something. Signing it away quietly felt, to Walter, like it would have been a second burial, one nobody would ever get the chance to dig back up. Within a month, their legal team had filed a motion challenging the charter's validity on multiple fronts, arguing it had never been properly recorded, and therefore had no legal force, arguing that, even if authentic, the passage of over a century without any prior claim constituted abandonment of any rights it might have granted, and arguing more aggressively that the document Walter had found might not even be authentic at all, and demanding it be turned over for forensic and historical analysis before any further claims proceeded. Walter agreed to the analysis. He had nothing to hide, and honestly, some part of him almost hoped they'd find it was a fake, a strange, historical curiosity, rather than the center of a legal storm that had turned half his town against the other half. But the analysis, conducted by a university historical documents lab, confirmed what Rutherford had already suspected. The ink, the paper stock, the handwriting patterns, and even the specific legal phrasing used in the document were entirely consistent with authentic land charters from that specific region and decade. It wasn't a fake. The case moved from a dispute over authenticity to a dispute over law, specifically the old and thorny question of what happens when an unrecorded but legally executed historical document surfaces generations later, and how it interacts with a century of good faith property transactions built on the assumption it never existed. It took the better part of a year, 3 separate hearings, a deposition where Walter had to describe, in detail, exactly how he pried up a floorboard with a crowbar in March, and testimony from 2 historians and 1 very expensive title law expert flown in from the state capitol. The county judge, coincidentally sitting in the very same courthouse, whose 1933 fire had likely destroyed whatever official copy of the 1887 charter might once have existed, issued her ruling on a Thursday morning in late autumn, almost exactly a year after Walter had pried up that floorboard. She did not rule that Whitlock Aggregate had to shut down the quarry, or that 90 families would lose their livelihoods overnight, as the most dramatic rumors around town had predicted. The law, as it turned out, was more careful than the rumors. She ruled that the 1887 charter was authentic and legally binding at the time of its creation, but that the doctrine of latches and the equitable rights of good faith purchasers who had spent decades investing in land under a reasonable belief in clean title meant the quarry's existing operations could continue. Whitlock would not be forced to shut down or return the land. But she also ruled that the original charter's clause reserving mineral royalties for the perpetual benefit of the schoolhouse and its founding trust had never been legally extinguished, and that going forward Whitlock Aggregate and any future operator on that land would owe an ongoing royalty on all mineral extraction paid not to Walter personally, but into a trust administered by the holder of the schoolhouse title for the specific and permanent benefit of education in Barrow Hollow. It was, as Rutherford put it afterward, about as fair a splitting of an impossible baby as anyone could have asked a judge to do. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, reporters from 2 regional news stations were waiting on the steps, along with what felt to Walter like half of Barrow Hollow, crowded onto the sidewalk in the cold. Frank Delaney found Walter in the crowd before Walter found him, and to Walter's surprise, the quarry manager shook his hand and told him quietly that he was glad it hadn't gone any worse for either side. 90 families still have their jobs, Delaney said. And your town got something out of the ground that isn't limestone for once. Walter thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. Whitlock kept its quarry and its 90 jobs. The town's schools gained a permanent funding stream nobody had budgeted for and nobody could take away. One that would over the following years fund new roofing, updated science labs, and a scholarship fund that would eventually be renamed in honor of the woman who had discovered it wasn't hers to keep, after Walter, without much fanfare, donated the schoolhouse itself to the county's historical preservation trust on the condition that the building be fully restored and permanently protected. Walter never took a cent of the royalties for himself. Legally, as the man who'd owned the schoolhouse when the charter was found, he could have made an argument for some personal claim to at least a portion of the settlement. His cousin told him more than once that he'd have been within his rights too. He said no every time. I bought that building for $800 to keep kids from breaking their necks jumping through a busted window, he told a local reporter, in the only interview he ever agreed to give. Feels wrong to turn around and take money that was set aside 140 years ago for kids to have a school. Wasn't mine to take. Never was. Today the old Barrow Hollow schoolhouse stands fully restored, new roof, original bell tower rebuilt board by board. A small brass plaque by the door explaining its history to the schoolchildren, who now visit on field trips, most of whom have absolutely no idea that the reason their science lab has new microscopes has anything to do with an old man, a rusted metal box, and a floorboard that just wouldn't sit flush. Walter still lives on his 18 acres. His fence line is quiet now. Nobody climbs it to break into the schoolhouse anymore. There's nothing left worth breaking into, and honestly, there never really was. He just didn't know, back when he wrote that $800 check, that some of the most important things in a small town don't get buried in the ground. Sometimes they just get buried under the floor, waiting for somebody stubborn enough to pull up the right board.